We're joined today by author Alicia Yamin and panelists Louise, Ivers, Jessie Bump, and Aziza Ahmed. Dr. Alicia Yamin is a lecturer on law and the senior fellow on global health and rights at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School, adjunct senior lecturer on health policy and management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and senior advisor on human rights and health policy at the Global Health Justice Organization, Partners in Health. She is known globally for her transdisciplinary work in relation to economic and social rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, the right to health, and the intersections between development paradigms and human rights. Dr. Louise Ivers is director of the Harvard Global Health Institute, director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Global Health, and the David Bangsberg, MD, MPH Endowed Chair in Global Health Equity at Mass General Hospital. She's a professor of global health and social medicine and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Ivers works on the implementation of health programs with the goal of advancing health equity and access to care and social services for impoverished communities, supported by research and advocacy. She is a practicing infectious disease physician in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Mass General Hospital. Dr. Jessie Bump is executive director of the Takemi program on international health and lecturer on global health policy in the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and a member of the Bergen Center for Ethics and Priority Setting at the University of Bergen. His work is focused on the special opportunities to build health systems and advance social protections during and after widespread disruption by infectious disease epidemics, colonial extraction, conflict, industrialization, globalization, and other processes. Aziza Ahmed is a professor of law at Boston University School of Law, an N. Neil Pike Scholar, and co-director of the BU Law Program in Reproductive Justice. Her scholarship examines the intersection of law, politics, and science in the fields of constitutional law, criminal law, health law, and family law. Prior to teaching, Professor Ahmed was a research associate at the Harvard School of Public Health Program on International Health and Human Rights, and a member of the Technical Advisory Group on HIV and the Law, convened by the United Nations Development Program. We'll now turn it over to the speakers for discussion, after which we'll have time for an audience question and answer. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. We'll all try to be as brief as possible so we get engagement, because you made the effort to come out in person. I have some thank yous too. I want to thank the Petrie-Flom Center, Professor Glenn Cohen, my colleagues Chloe Reichel, Laura Chong, Susanna Baruch. I want to thank the Harvard Law Library that arranges these talks, and especially Maya Bergamascu. And I want to thank my colleagues here, Louise, Jessie, and Aziza, for taking the time to read the book carefully, which is really a great gift. And I'm also grateful for Stanford University Press and Kate Wall, the executive editor, in particular the editor-in-chief, deciding that it was worthwhile to bring out a second edition, which is really almost a new book. The lessons from the pandemic are not one chapter added on to a first edition, but are really woven throughout the book and have reconfigured a lot of the things that I argued in the first book, in the first edition. So even when the first edition came out, which was literally within days of the WHO declaring that SARS-CoV-2 was a public health emergency of international concern, and a month later it was a pandemic, we saw a number of things already. Climate crisis was evident, that we were struggling to keep below 1.5 degrees centigrade change. We saw the shackles of debt and austerity across the global south that were continuing after the 2008 financial crisis. Decades of privatized and underfunded health systems and highly medicalized care versus public health were showing signs of their impacts, which were absolutely lethal when the pandemic struck. We had seen neoliberalism undermine social protection, decimate labor unions and labor protections, and expand profound social, gender, and racial inequalities within the United States and around the world. We'd also come to believe that the private sector had the answer, that philanthropic capitalism, like the Gates Foundation, was going to rescue us. And that also would turn out to be a really lethal mistake during the pandemic. We saw already at that point, I started writing the first edition in 2017. Trump had been elected, Brexit had happened, a peace accord referendum in Colombia was narrowly defeated. Populism was, far-right populism was sweeping the world already. And it was clear that the multilateral order that had been established post-World War II that was supposed to ensure justice, peace, and security was not fit for purpose, was unable to deal with migration, climate change, economic inequality, and the like. But at the same time, within the constellation of what I would call health and human rights scholarship literature, there was a kind of triumphalism of like, well, we've built these scaffoldings so successfully and elaborated these normative frameworks, and now is the time for implementation. Now is the time for bureaucratic operationalization, for human rights through global health governance. And I felt that there was a significant disconnect between what I was seeing in reality on the ground and the way things were being framed by the human rights community with which I had most contact. So what is the approach of the book? It takes a temporal sequence, starting approximately 50 years ago and going decade by decade. Some chapters are half a decade, some chapters are a full decade, and there's some obvious overlap. And it's really directed at students, because students aren't always familiar with what was structural adjustment. Some students ask me, what is neoliberalism, right? So it's really to understand what we have to do now, we have to understand where we've been. And I should point out that I do not share those appraisals of human rights that say we have been complicit in the advance of neoliberalism. I make it very clear that I think human rights is a tapestry of a variety of different kinds of groups. I myself really learned many of the skills and did much of the work in my career in Latin America and was taught by the Latin American human rights movement. We saw the retraction of the state from different social spheres as a violence, as a structural form of violence. So I do reject that kind of broad brush narrative that has become commonplace in these days. It's also a synthesis across multiple fields. We are constantly told we need to specialize, we need to have, very profound knowledge of certain specific areas, which is true on the one hand, but on the other, it stymies our ability to see connections and to make progressive change that requires working across borders, working across disciplinary borders. And many of the things that have shaped the trajectory lie at the interstices of development paradigms, the development of international law, etc. And the third thing to say about this book is that it weaves together, as I have in other books, firsthand experience, very explicitly from my own particular positionality, with the more theoretical analysis. And I do that primarily because I believe, after all of these years of doing this work, that the best way to understand why it is important to treat health as a right is by understanding what it means in individuals' lives. So every chapter opens with a small story and closes with a small story. And I'll give you a sense of that. As bodies lining the Ganges, mass graves in Brazilian favelas, and makeshift morgues in New York flowed across our large and small screens during the first years of the pandemic, along with a daily saturation of numbing statistics, even those not visited directly by the Grim Reaper were forced to contemplate whose deaths are grieved and why. Grief and mourning are not the same. We mourn many public figures whose obituaries elide episodes of their fecklessness. We take note, if not mourn, the passing of the masters of the universe who try to defy the myth of Icarus. We mourn the soldiers, often in the prime of their lives, who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Grief, as opposed to mourning, is a private affair, reserved to those for whom the absence of a purpose leaves their inner world shattered. Sometimes, however, in the very saddest of cases, neither grief nor mourning are to be found in the shadow of the loss cast by death. Blame, shame, and recriminations, or merely indifference, fill the space that a human being used to inhabit. The death of Paula Arisanca Barrientos, who was 35 years old when she died in childbirth in the early 2000s, was one of those cases. And then I go on and explain her case and weave together what was happening in the world that explains that situates that particular personal story. This is it's called the Putuco on the Altiplano in Peru, where she died, where her mother died giving birth as well. And this is her husband at her gravestone. So the things that I set out, the framing of the book is that we who started out decades ago in economic and social rights had three challenges. One was to subvert the entrenched ideas that health and other socioeconomic rights were not real rights, but just programmatic aspirations. We have come a very long way since I was a student here at Harvard Law School. Health rights and other socioeconomic rights are enforced by courts in middle-income countries, in low-income countries, in high-income countries alike. We have a long way to go. We have to figure out how to do so in a way that expands equity. We have to figure out how to deal with very complex judgments, which is an issue in climate justice litigation as well as health. But we have come a very long way. Second, we had to articulate what it means to take health rights seriously in laws, policies, and practices, which is related but different and is not self-evident. And here too, I think we have come a long way. We have tools, we have principles, but we certainly, and I don't think we should, have a formula or a recipe. We certainly have made progress, but we have a long way to go. The third thing that we wanted when I was here and friends of mine set out who would later create the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which I worked with and I was on the board of, we wanted to demonstrate that using economic and social rights could achieve meaningful progress towards social justice, could dilute economic power in the same way that civil and political rights had diluted political power. And it's not a spoiler alert to say we have not achieved this. So why is that? Well, over time, inequality has vastly increased since the late 1970s and early 1980s. And the top 10% in the United States, and primarily the top 1%, has derived all of the benefit of that wealth creation. And these inequalities, which are not just in the United States, they're all around the world, are racialized, they are gendered, they have extreme effects on persons with disabilities and other kinds of marginalization. But it's not just that. It is that although there has never been more wealth in the world, and the narrative of scarcity is something we absolutely should reject, much of the wealth has been privatized. So private capital has grown exponentially, whereas public capital has not. Public capital is the wealth that we use to build resilient health systems, to build education systems, to build infrastructure, to build social protection systems. Private wealth is the wealth that redounds to the same people, the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses and the Bill Gateses and the other gazillionaires. Now, some of you may be saying, oh, well, that's way too simplistic, and I'm happy to talk about public-private partnerships or blended finance later during the Q&A. But for now, I would say that this trend has literally not just the concentration of economic power has deformed our political processes, but it has colonized our imaginations to think that somehow the masters of capital markets know best, that they have more intuition about how we should run our politics in our countries. And ordinary people are squeezed out of making decisions that affect our lives and well-being. If you look globally, the situation is in some ways even bleaker because of unequal terms of exchange. Right? So the suppression of wages in the global south, illicit financial transfers, which include multinational tax evasion, intellectual property, which is a big part of this story. Intellectual property is, among other things, a massive wealth redistribution from south to north. So this far exceeds anything that we so-called give in aid to the south. So much of the book has this, or I wrote it in a way that I hope it has, a kind of, these two truths can coexist. So take the 1990s, which 2 chapters are devoted to about Mexico and Peru. It is absolutely true that we had groundbreaking, landmark transsectoral conferences. Zhongtian on food security, Cairo on population and development, Beijing on women, Rio on environment, Copenhagen on social development. And those spawned institutions, they spawned conceptualizations that were important for development and for rights. We also had transformative constitutionalism sweeping many countries in the world, from South Africa to Argentina, posing a much more robust idea of enforcement of economic and social rights, and a very different relationship between courts and other institutions of the state. At the same time, the 90s were a decade of deepening neoliberalism, of trade liberalization. It was the time when the WTO was created with biting enforcement powers. There was massive financial deregulation at the end of the 1990s. And that all had toxic synergies with autocrats. So, for example, in the chapter on Peru, I describe how Fujimori, who was the president of Peru at the time, and a poster child for the IMF and the World Bank, had sweeping health reform along neoliberal prerogatives that he pushed through with zero legislation, almost 1,000 decrees, zero democratic deliberation, which suited him very, very well. A lot of the book talks about the recursiveness of the national and the international, that we can't really understand what is going on in one space without what's going on in the other space, and about how we should not just be attentive to specific court judgments or specific law reforms, but much of using human rights for progressive social change is about indirect effects, about coalitions that are created in activist communities, the restructuring of different institutions, and symbolic ideational effects where people appropriate their own agency. So one of the examples I give in the book is the white kerchiefs of the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo in the civic military dictatorship in Argentina were transformed and transmuted into the green kerchiefs and banners in the green wave for reproductive justice in Argentina and then throughout the region. And that transformation of what is not a misfortune but actually an injustice also shapes our understanding of what is required for meaningful democracy. Because in Argentina, reproductive autonomy is now an ingredient of what is required for an engendered democracy. A lot of the book, obviously, is about health. Taking a rights approach to health, I argue, changes the evaluative space. You cannot think of health as just this biomedical, stochastic phenomena that exists within individual bodies. We have to understand social determinants of the conditions in which we are born and live and work and age and fall ill, and also how we understand health. and which goes beyond DNA and the results on a blood test, et cetera. I talk a lot about social medicine, a lot about indigenous understandings of health that are different from the Eastern understandings of health, that are different from our traditional biomedical understanding. Health systems, in turn, also are shaped in a rights framework. They're not technocratic apparatuses. I think many of us during COVID began to appreciate this much more, that health systems, like justice systems, can exclude and marginalize and punish certain populations, but they can also be used to integrate and deepen democracy if structured correctly. And that structuring is how health systems are financed, how services are organized, whether people have a role to play in priority setting. We saw during the pandemics triage of ventilators, for example, that discriminated blatantly against persons with disabilities. People should have a right to participate in decisions that affect their well-being just as they do in other decisions. That's sort of the core of human rights. And at the micro level of treatment at point of care, which also is how we treat providers, whether they have labor protections and labor rights, not just persons. So this moving toward universal health coverage, which is the big goal of the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a big summit a couple of weeks ago in New York, is not just a technical challenge. It is a normative challenge. How do we expand services? Do we expand services at the expense of increasing out-of-pocket costs? Do we include more services for certain populations? Those are normative challenges, and that is repeated over and over again throughout the book with different examples. As I said, the pandemic is not just a chapter at an end, but there is one chapter that goes through the time of the pandemic, in which the story is about a Guatemalan refugee who has Parkinson's disease, who's in Boston now. And a lot of the things that the pandemic revealed, I think, will not be surprises to anybody in this room. We're absolutely not all in this together, as Bill and Melinda Gates happily said at the very beginning. The pandemic accelerated trends toward illiberalism. Many states autocratic states used the excuse of states of exception, states of emergency, that now it's going to be difficult to pull back on. There were massive, massive human rights violations, both in places that had lockdowns and in places that did not. And human health rights violations, because health rights is not merely containing COVID. And I also talk about how the importance of political culture and infrastructures. The independent panel on preparedness, on prevention and preparedness of pandemics, said countries that had more flexibility, where people could take time off, where they could get social protection if they weren't going to work, where they weren't in informality, did much better during the pandemic. Many of my colleagues say that the pandemic shook the foundations of global governance. I argue in the book that they were not shaken, they were revealed as profoundly, profoundly colonialist. Not just in the debacle of the TRIPS waiver, but also, for example, in what's happening now, in the issuance of special drawing rights, in the new layers of debt and austerity that are being imposed across the global south. And this chapter also looks at global health justice, which is a major concern now in terms of the future pandemic accord. And I argue that interstate transfers and financial assistance and cooperation are radically insufficient to be considered real, meaningful global health justice. And we need to think about these structural rules of the game of tax and debt and development finance. And historically, what reparative justice do we owe? This Guatemalan refugee who is in the United States, we talk about the crisis at the border with immigrants. If we had a historical sense of what we owe to the people in Central America, we wouldn't be talking about it that way. So I actually am going to stop here. I've gone on too long, and I'm eager to hear what my colleagues have to say. I'm happy to answer questions about all of these things. I will say to the students who are in the room, this is a nice mix, but to the students in the room who are planning to use human rights for social justice, whether it's for health or climate or other things, I'm often asked, am I hopeful? Well, I'm not Pollyannish, but I am hopeful because of the students that I have, and I'm hopeful that throughout this time, things that we thought were impossible, turned out to be possible through collective organizing and collective action. So I am hopeful, and I would urge you to choose your traveling companions well, because it is they, as I say in the book, who will wipe your tears and pick you up when things go badly, when you lose cases, when you lose patients, when you are faced with cynicism and hypocrisy from the powers that be, or even others who are ostensibly on your side. So I would encourage you to choose your colleagues carefully and to do everything you can, because it depends on you what the future will look like. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm a practicing infectious diseases doctor in the global health space, and I will make my very brief comments in that context. I came to the work with a understanding of health as a human right, but without a deep knowledge of the history, the structures, and the theory about it. And I find this book to be a gift to me, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's engaged in the struggle for a healthy society. What I think is so brilliant about the book, and one of the many things, is the interweaving of the personal, the lived experience, the historical record, and the future path. And the future path is set out as something that is accessible. The book is written from this very authoritative grounding, and it's really well researched in a way to really help us reframe what we might have perceived for those less informed. I'll put myself in there as just misfortune, but reframed as truly issues around reparative justice. Throughout the book, Dr. Yamin highlights these tensions between the extraordinary progress that we have collectively made, and at the same time the devastating cost and unequal cost of that in societies. But yet, throughout the book, you don't let us fall into despair. You call us, you set an invitation to us to take part in the struggle. And I think one thing that is really excellent from my perspective in reading was how you cast a really clear view of how dignity is such an important part of human rights. You set this clear path forward, calling on us to target all forms of inequality, to focus on the infrastructure, including the organizing of care economies, democratizing knowledge, and continuously reflect. And I think perhaps the brilliance in the book for me is this continuous reflection of yourself without overly inserting your own experiences, but really drawing on them to enlighten and deepen the experience of the reader. I'm going to pass to my colleague, but I wanted to read one thing that really struck with me on page 220 in describing Vinicio, who is in Chile in a case where his father had died in the public health system. And he says, for them, my father was just another poor man who died in a public hospital. We have suffered too much. And the book uses these types of experiences and exposition of the personal experience to really highlight the issues and calls us all to action in a very clear and thoughtful way. I'll pass in the interest of time to Professor Bill.
Thank you, Louise. Yeah, so I received this assignment with some trepidation, like being asked to a famous chef's home to critique a meal. And in that spirit of maybe just a little more spice or something, I'm going to focus only on spelling and grammar. My first suggestion or question is, what would happen if instead of social equality, what if we said equity? And I'm thinking about that because equity means fairness, and it's already a history, but as a historian, if you historicize a history, I think about this rise of individual rights within constraining institutions. Like, I really like that construction, and instead of thinking of the 70s, I think of the Second World War. And I know Prebish appears in here, but Prebish and Singer were thinking about this from a collective perspective. So they were advocating for a role of the World Bank should be to give interest-free capital to developing countries. They were thinking about trade reform as a way of contesting the economic structures that they thought were going to constrain human rights correctly. They forecast it based on economic history, already 50 years of the 20th century by the time they were theorizing. They thought about this and they lost, right? The Prebish and Singer reforms to the UN didn't happen. The role of the World Bank got shifted. And what became GATT was first the International Trade Organization. So under the ITO, countries were able to, or the proposition was that countries would be able to regulate trade according to domestic employment impact. Coming out of the Depression, where employment was a human right, I kind of wonder, like, what would Professor Yamin say if she cast herself as part of this longer historical struggle of people who have tried and until now often failed? How do we advance this? And then my second spelling suggestion would be, like, what happens if you, instead of taking human rights, what if you made that humans' rights? So if you pluralize the human and singularize the right, then you're talking more about the social contract. So not an individual right, but the collective expression of government. What happens if you think about rights that way? And our justice system in the US and elsewhere is not really set up for that. But the fact that it isn't is one reason why we can overlook historic injustices, group injustices. And that brings me to the third idea, which is what if you switch the title around to say when injustice becomes misfortune? And that speaks to the purpose of the book rather than to rearrange it. But it made me think of what happens in historic injustices that become accepted. Injustices that have gone on so long that people move on. Maybe not those suffering most directly, but others. It made me think of the Ewe people who were divided by the Germans in West Africa. It was a founding goal of the League of Nations to bring justice to them. And the All-Ewe Conference was one of the first things the UN did in 1949. And it didn't work out. It didn't work out for Palestinians. It hasn't worked out for any of the founding objectives of the UN around human rights. And these are injustices that maybe have become acceptable to an ignorant public, but it's the same question of what do we do now? What do we do next? And how do we move on from places that are now ossified in a set of economic strictures that make progress so much more difficult? So I'm going to pause there on my spelling and grammar and congratulate Ali for a wonderful book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll just begin also for thanking Ali for writing this wonderful and amazing book. And I was a long time ago a student of Ali's, and so it's really nice to be. I don't know if maybe you didn't remember that, but it's nice to be engaged as a colleague now, and but also still continue to learn from you and all of the work that you've done. I thought I would just tease out three of what I took away to be some of the provocations of the book, and I think they're resonant with some of what you've said already, and so hopefully we can get into a little bit of a conversation. But first, I really read this book to be a reminder that in order to think about human rights and rights, we have to think broadly and go outside a simple rights framework. And I think there's echoes of that in the comments that have already been said. And instead, we have to think about the political and economic forces that drive the ability of individuals to even realize their rights or demand them to begin with. Here, Ali's book is really resonant with critical legal theory and theorists who have called on a focus on background rules, contract and property, that set the stage for the issues that one might ought to be focused on rather than the rights issue in front of you. In numerous instances, Ali highlights the way in which we have to understand the shifts in the economic order, in particular since the 1970s, namely the rise of neoliberalism, if we want to understand how and why we see the rights violations that we do. And in the book, COVID-19 provides a strong example of the need to recognize these broader economic shifts. How do we understand the impossibility, for example, of a robust public health response globally and nationally without first seeing that public health infrastructure has been destroyed through the free market small government ideology that seeped into the United States over the course of decades, and also to aid dependent countries through their structural adjustment programs that very clearly limited spending on health and education. All of this rings so true, especially in the context of the United States, and one of the areas I write on is the abortion context, in which we too can see, even just in that line of jurisprudence, the way economic ideological shifts have provided a sort of lubricant for the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade, and in fact furthers the idea that the state is no longer responsible for providing a full range of reproductive health services. And in fact, if you read the Dobbs decision, there's nothing about health. It's all about politics and morality. It's like a public health issue just gets thrown to the people. Following from Ali's book, we really understand that we can't simply look at reproductive rights for the sake of looking at reproductive rights in a narrow sense. Instead, we have to see the full picture. We have to understand how the court has steadily justified, in the context of the sort of transformations around these rights, the refusal of the state to provide adequate services. Poverty is not the making of the court, a sentiment forwarded in two important reproductive rights cases, Maher and Harris v. McRae, in which the court basically says, therefore, it's not our problem to provide you or support you with a robust set of public health, reproductive health services. And how else, and we do need to understand this, because of course, how else would we be able to understand our current state of affairs without seeing this broader historical, political, and economic context that Ali writes about and points us to. There's a tension I sensed in the book, however, and this is something I'd love to hear your reflections on, Ali, which is, are human rights a product of these social, legal, and political and economic contexts, or do they sometimes sit independent of them, and in turn are they able to be conjured in a way that allows us to sort of call on them to protect particular types of economic abuse? When I read the book, I read you to be landing somewhere in the middle, acknowledging the political context of human rights, but also celebrating their possibility, as you sort of ended in your own comments. This paradox, I think, is present in your discussions of global agreements on women's health and abortion. In these contexts, for example, where the Catholic Church and conservative countries play an oversized role in treaty negotiations, it's impossible not to see how politics shapes human rights law. And yet, you come back and you often hold out hope, discussing that in the context of the right to development, that the discourses that travel with human rights, like rule of law, accountability, non-discrimination, participation, are often understood to be welcome developments. There seems to be some hope in the abstraction of the principles upon which human rights are founded, even when you acknowledge that the ideas themselves are entangled with local political cultures. That said, one gets the sense in reading the book and the anecdotes that it's precisely from the struggle between context and abstraction where the rubber hits the road. This is where change happens, for better or worse. That the apolitical features of law and development, for example, of which human rights is part of a bigger story, lends itself to opportunity. And here I'm thinking about your story about safe motherhood. And in the context of the Millennium Development Goals, which you talk about quite often in the book. And of course, we all know that the Millennium Development Goals were agreed upon development goals by countries on education, health, and so on, and each calls upon its own experts to arrive at and bring countries to settled outcomes. Ali really shows how in a hotly contested moral and religious space, abortion and safe motherhood, it is a technocratic set of agreements, the Millennium Development Goals, that ultimately provide an opportunity for exploitation by conservative Catholics in Peru. This is all on page 122 in case you want to look later. The purported neutrality of the institutions exploited, as well as the technocratic accompaniments to human rights law or experts on whatever topic, sort of occur over and over again, and now we see it in the safe motherhood and abortion space. The purported neutrality of the institutions themselves and the technocracy provides an opportunity for the Catholic Church to sort of come into that space and wear a new cloak of legitimacy and own this new vocabulary. But as I read this book, I started to wonder again, maybe what Ali's reminding us is that at times it's about the contestation that's enabled by the institutions that matter. It's not just, what the specific outcomes are in a particular point in time. And that it's a contestation that really counts. And finally, and third, I read Ali's book as sort of taking on a problem faced by many legal institutions today, including the U.S. Supreme Court, which is that of a legitimation crisis. And here another set of questions comes into play. What does it even mean to do human rights when 50 years into a formal institutionalization of human rights, courts, mechanisms, treaties, etc., the world is as bad as it ever was? Has human rights even contributed at all, to a sense of resistance? Or alternatively, would everything be even worse if we didn't have human rights? Or, as some have proffered, do human rights contribute to and walk lockstep with neoliberalism? Of course, historians have also contested that idea. But part of all this is sort of part of what I took away from the book is seeing how you really describe how it is that we should begin to fix these problems and fix this world and use human rights for the better. Some of what you offer us are technical and doctrinal. How do we expand or shift the idea of core obligations under the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights? How do we move past the question of progressive realization into something more meaningful, you could say? How do you improve accountability, especially when it comes to aid-giving countries? And we've talked about patents already. And some of this is about human rights education, as you say. How do we broaden an individual sense of entitlement beyond the citizen? But despite all this, your book lands with possibility and promise. And as I said, you engage this critical theory all throughout. You don't really cede to the skepticism of human rights, and you really stay strong in your faith of a sort of liberal internationalism through this contestation that could bring about real change. So thank you so much for writing this. It was wonderful to read.
If we could give our speakers one more hand. So we are going to move to our audience Q&A section right now. So my colleague Christine is going to grab a mic. If you have a question for the speakers, please raise your hand and Christine will come around with the mic. We do ask that you speak directly into the mic so that the Zoom participants can hear you as well.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really glad that this book exists. My name is Rita. I'm a primary care doctor and a visiting researcher at the FXB Centre for Health and Human Rights. And I'm really interested in the health impacts of climate change. And there's been a few cases recently, thinking specifically of the case in Montana of young people bringing the state to court around their right to a healthful environment being under threat. And I'm curious about what that means for us as physicians and as public health specialists who are seeing failures to deliver health because of systematic and environmental challenges. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions of how we might better proactively or systematically work with lawyers to be able to utilize human rights frameworks to legislate around such failures to deliver health.
Well, I do think that's a promising, so that's a particular case, right, because of the Montana Constitution. There's a lot of climate litigation, actually, in Europe and as well as Latin America, and I would encourage you to come to an event on climate litigation in Latin America on November 3rd. Having lawyers work with doctors has been, there are medico-legal partnerships, and these have existed now for decades. It's challenging. Working across disciplines and not having fiefdoms and actually working across disciplines and learning from each other is challenging. So I don't have a magic bullet answer, but it's clear that the examples that I give in the book of developing human rights-based approaches and going from kind of the ideas through the normative scaffolding to court enforcement through implementation have all required empirical evidence from public health professionals. So in HIV or in maternal health, and so it's clear that we need to do this better. And it's not like everybody is going to have multiple degrees. But we don't educate that way. We still educate in silos, right? So it's very, very challenging to be able to work together and find colleagues to actually not just opportunistically contribute to one case with an amicus or something, but to do it over the long haul, because it really requires weaving relationships of trust in issues that move from one case to the next, to backlash, etc. And I don't think we've figured that out very well. I think there are promising examples, but I don't think we figured it out very well yet. June?
Hi, I'm June Ehrlich. I'm the editor of Reproductive, the Harvard Review of Latin America. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I was just curious, when you talked a lot about the Gates Foundation, and as you know, in Latin America, there's not much of a concept of philanthropy. The philanthropy gets donated at Harvard and the Dave Rockefeller Center. But you seem to be a bit negative about philanthropy, and I was wondering if you could tease out the uses of philanthropy and why it doesn't work or how it could work.
Well, so I do single out the Gates Foundation, and I'm fortunate in that way because I'm not a PI. Most of the people at the Chan School will be PIs on Gates grants. So, you know, when the pandemic struck, the Gates Foundation was the second largest donor to the World Health Organization. The Gates Foundation is accountable to Bill and Melinda, maybe a couple of other people. It's not accountable to a broader common good or public. And the Gates Fund, in that particular instance, he has a strong belief in intellectual property. So when there were two potential options at the beginning of the pandemic of a technology transfer held in the WHO versus what became COVAX, which was sort of accumulating donated vaccines. It was one pillar of the ACT Accelerator. Gates really weighed in and used his clout to push us toward COVAX. And that was a total disaster, right? And so I do single them out as having played a very large role in the de-democratization of global health. And obviously the Gates Foundation has done a tremendous amount of good in many, many countries, but I think they should pay their taxes. And it should not be up to him to decide, because now the truth is that the Gates Foundation largely determines priorities in global health, determines the metrics by which progress is measured, funds the institutions like the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, as well as UN institutions that do the evaluations. So the whole funds journals that then publish on the results. And that is, those kinds of economies of influence are not good for science and not good for public health. So yes, I feel that it's not just, and in general, I think that if more taxes were paid, like in Latin America, if Carlos Slim paid his taxes, things would be better off than him saying, okay, I want to contribute to X, Y, or Z. I'm not opposed to philanthropy. I think philanthropy can do a lot of great things. But the structural rules of the game that give such immense power to a few families versus the rest of us are not directed at a common good.
Thank you.
So thank you to our speakers for sharing your insights. Let's thank them all again for coming today.